A strayed dog was found infested with ticks. No one could believe how it survived for so long. And when rescuers found out the real reason why, they are left speechless. Sophie's morning run was nearly over when she saw it. Something motionless near the playground slide. At first, she thought it was trash. Then, she saw the flies. And then, the smell hit her. What do you think it was? She stopped. Her breath caught in her throat. It was a dog, a dead dog. It lay completely still near the base of the slide, and its fur was matted with what looked like blood. Fleas clung to him in their numbers like dark parasites feasting on its wounds. Sophie felt her stomach turn, and she almost threw up. She was going to flee from the sight, but something in its eyes stopped her. They were filled with something that felt eerily present. Then, she suddenly noticed the rise and fall of her breath and its twitching ear. It was still alive. Sophie hesitated, her heart beating fast. What had happened to it? A flash from the past made her pulse quicken even more. In high school, she had been left in the playground too, battered and beaten. But this was worse. Who had done this to this poor animal? She wasn't supposed to stop. She had a routine. She should just run and... The dog let out a whimper, and she jumped. She had seen this before. Helplessness. The feeling of being left behind. She immediately realized how selfish she was and realized she was acting like the other kids at her high school who had felt sorry for her but never helped her or even tried to stop her bullies. What would you do if you found a dog like Max? Sophie knelt beside him immediately. "Hey, buddy," she whispered. His scars looked deeper than they had from afar, and they twisted around his body like an ugly map. Whoever hurt him had been very brutal. In fact, the dog should be dead. "You are so strong," she whispered. Her gaze dropped to his eyes again. She had seen sad dogs before, but this was different. His eyes were not just sad, they were haunted. She should call someone, anyone, maybe animal control or a rescue. But the thought of leaving him here, alone, to get help that might never come, did not feel right. If she walked away now, he might not make it. She yanked off her sweatshirt and wrapped it around his frail body before scooping him into her arms. He stiffened, but he didn't fight. He only let out a feeble whimper. He was heavier than he looked, but she managed to stand. His weak neck made his head loll against her shoulder, and the putrid stench of his dirty fur and dried blood stung her nose. But she ignored it. Her car was parked at the other end of the park. It was a 15-minute walk, but that morning it felt longer. She did not know it yet. But this decision was about to unravel something far greater than anything she could ever imagine. An hour later, Sophie sat stiffly in the corner of a dimly lit examination room. The dog lay motionless on a steel table as Dr. Langston ran his hands over its battered body. Sophie had seen enough medical dramas to recognize the tension in the vet's posture. "How bad is it?" Dr. Langston exhaled sharply. "He's been through hell," he answered, walking to a cabinet to retrieve a syringe. "Multiple lacerations, broken ribs that never healed, signs of malnourishment. They only mean one thing." Sophie frowned. "What?" Langston hesitated. He was in an illegal dog-fighting ring. Sophie's jaw dropped. "What? You think he escaped from them?" "Maybe even dumped," he shrugged. "Either way, if they realize he's still alive, they won't be happy." Sophie turned as the dog shifted weakly. Tears stung her eyes. She had been badly bullied in the past, but this was far worse than anything she had to endure. "He is staying with me." The words left her mouth before she could think. Langston's eyes snapped to hers. "That's a terrible idea." "I don't care." He dropped the syringe. "Listen to me, Sophie. These people, if they find out you have one of their dogs, they will make sure there's nothing left of you or him." "I can't just leave him." Langston let out a sigh. "You know you can't change what happened to you in the past by—" "I'm not trying to change anything. He needs help. I'll help him." He turned to glance at the dog again. When he looked back, there was something softer in his eyes. "Then he's lucky you found him." Sophie felt a smile tug at her cheeks. "I'm naming him Max," she said quietly. Langston smiled too. "Of course you are." "I'll do what I can to patch him up. But Sophie," he continued, If they come looking for him, you need to be ready." His tone was serious this time. A strange sensation filled her head. The one time she tried to stand up to her bullies, they had beaten her up, but these ones had hurt a poor dog, so she wasn't backing down. Back home, Max remained on the thick blanket she left him. His breathing was shallow, so she knew he was in pain. Sophie sat on the floor nearby, watching him with the dim light of a lamp. She couldn't tell if he was sleeping or just too exhausted to lift his head. But ever so often, his legs twitched painfully, as if in a phantom fight. Sophie still wondered if she was doing the right thing. This was getting deeper. Her life could be in danger. But then, so was Max's life, she realized, and between them, only one of them was helpless. She was keeping him. Max did not trust her at first, but he soon began to. It started small. The first morning, when she set a bowl of food in front of him, Max did not eat right away. He glared at her warily, and his dark eyes tracked every move she made. Seconds turned into minutes, but finally, he inched toward the bowl, and he took a small bite of the food, then another. He ate like he expected the food to be snatched away. The damage ran deep. Loud noises made him panic. Even the sound of a car backfiring down the street made him scramble to his feet, with his paws skidding against the floor. One night, a sudden gust of wind knocked a broom over in the kitchen, and Max lunged into the corner, his entire body shaking. Sophie had to sit a few feet away and soothe him. "You're safe here, Max," she kept repeating. It took time, but as the days went by, he stopped flinching every time she walked by. He learned the sound of her voice meant food, comfort, and not pain. He even started following her from room to room. But one night Sophie was curled up on the couch while Max lay nearby. She was about to turn off the lamp when she heard a low, rumbling growl. She turned her head slowly to see Max had gone rigid. His ears were pinned back, but his eyes were staring at something in the corner of the room. Sophie looked, but there was nothing there. "Max?" she whispered, but he growled again, louder this time. Sophie felt the air shift around her, and even the shadows in the corner seemed darker. Then, just as quickly as it started, Max whimpered and lay down. Sophie had never been more surprised, but she sighed in relief. She moved to him and knelt beside his trembling body. It was then she saw it for the first time. What do you think she saw? Sophie saw a brand. What do you think a brand on his body meant? She pushed his fur aside to get a better look. The mark was nearly lost beneath the coat, but it was there. It had been burned into his skin. They had branded him probably with a hot iron. What cruel people would do this? She had to find out. She opened her laptop and began researching illegal dog fighting. The first page results were sickening. It was filled with stories of underground rings, secret fights held in abandoned warehouses, dogs stolen and forced into brutal matches for sport. She scrolled until she found something that made her sit up, identifying dogfighting marks and tags. Sophie clicked the link, and a chart opened displaying different mark systems used by various fighting rings. According to the chart, brands were how the most valuable fighters were tagged. She scrolled down the chart slowly until she found the exact symbol she found on Max. The article listed the group behind it. They were called the Stonewell Pit. Sophie's stomach dropped. What do you think her reaction meant? Did she know them? She had heard of them on the news. It was an underground network notorious for its brutality, and now she had one of their dogs sleeping in her living room. Sophie hadn't meant to dig this deep, but she couldn't stop now. At first, it had been about saving Max from bullies, but now it had become about the other wounded dogs that never made it out. And the deeper she searched, the more she realized Max was evidence, and they wouldn't want that evidence walking around. She spent other nights after that scouring online forums for anything about Stonewell Pit. The first real clue came from a woman named Marla Green, who had posted in a local pet rescue group about her missing German Shepherd. Gone without a trace. No signs of him escaping, just vanished from my yard. The post had been flooded with similar stories from people in her community. They spoke of dogs disappearing overnight, and then of unmarked vans idling near parks. Sophie knew she had found her first link. She visited the community and tried to speak to a few people, but no one seemed to know more than what she had already discovered. She returned again and tried to trace Marla Green, but the sad woman didn't even want to talk about her dog anymore. Sophie shook her head. She did not know what she was doing. She was not a detective, so she decided to give it up. Unfortunately, it was too late for that. The first time she noticed the black SUV, she told herself it was nothing. The second time, outside the cafe, she felt her stomach drop. The third time, when it followed her home, she knew she was being watched. That night she went for a run like she always did. The street was quiet. Then she heard it. Footsteps. Sophie glanced over her shoulder and saw a figure moving under the shadows of the trees. She immediately knew she was being followed. Her heart skipped a beat, but she forced herself to stay calm. If she ran faster or screamed for help, he might attack. She needed to think fast. Her apartment was only 3 blocks away, and she didn't want a stalker to know about it. So she immediately turned the next corner and slipped between a row of parked cars. From her hidden spot, she tried to peek and get a better look at her stalker, but the figure had disappeared. Sophie did not sleep that night. Every sound made her flinch. They knew. Somehow, they knew she had been asking questions, and they wanted her to stop. She glanced at Max. He had barely survived whatever hell they had put him through. And there were more dogs still trapped in it. She couldn't ignore that part. She still had a choice. She could walk away, or she could take the next step. She looked down at Max again and realized the decision had already been made. Years ago, she would have given anything for anyone to care for her like this, but no one did, not even her parents. She knew then that the next step was to get the world involved. Sophie made a post on social media with a picture of Max, his haunted eyes staring into the camera and his healing body still scarred, and it went viral immediately. "This is Max," she had written underneath the pictures. "He was stolen, beaten, and forced to fight. How many others are still trapped?" The response was overwhelming. People expressed anger at the system, and animal lovers, activists, and concerned citizens demanded action, but it wasn't enough. She needed proof big enough to shut them down. Getting proof meant getting closer to the danger, so she finally reached out to an animal rescue group. The founders met with her in a dimly lit cafe. Their names were Nate and Olivia. "We need names, locations, maybe even video proof," Nate said. Sophie swallowed hard. "How do we get it?" she asked. Over the next week, she and the rescue group worked hard, piecing together what they knew. They mapped out locations where stolen pets had last been seen. They cross-checked reports of strange vans and abandoned warehouses. And slowly, a pattern emerged. Then came the tip. A man from an online forum messaged Sophie privately. "You want answers? Check out the old trucking depot on Willow Street." So they did. That night, Sophie crouched behind an old fence with her heart hammering in her chest. Nate and Olivia were beside her, but the warehouse was in front of them. Its metal windows were slightly open, and they could hear distant voices and the occasional burst of laughter. Suddenly, a dog yelped in pain, and Sophie's breath caught. They were there. They waited to confirm all the sounds were coming from the last floor of the building. Then she glanced at Nate, who nodded. He held up his phone, camera ready. Olivia did the same. They tiptoed to an open window and slipped inside. The stench hit first. Blood, sweat, and filth. The floor was covered in dirt and stains that Sophie didn't even recognize. Then she saw them. The cages. Rows of them lined the wall, crammed with dogs of all sizes. Some growled weakly, others barely lifted their heads. Sophie bit her lip. This was hell on earth. Nate was already filming. Olivia too, so she joined them. Suddenly, they heard footsteps. They did not wait to hear more. They turned and fled out the window immediately. But if Sophie thought they were not caught, she was very wrong. And she realized how wrong she was 2 nights later as she ran in fear. Max's paws pounded the pavement beside her. He did not understand what was happening, but he was spooked by her fear. Her mind replayed the last 20 minutes. Someone had kicked in her front door, and the crash had woken her. Then there was a voice in the darkness, low and deliberate. "You should have left it alone." Sophia had grabbed Max and bolted through the window, not stopping to see who it was or what they had come to do. She ran for a long distance before stopping. Max stopped too, breathing hard. Her fingers curled into fists. She wasn't about to back down. She hated bullies with everything. Sophie did not know where the courage was coming from, but she knew she wasn't giving up. She did not tell the rescue team about the break-in. They continued gathering evidence until they had enough, more than enough. And finally they found themselves in a cramped office in the station. It felt like a lifetime ago since she found Max lying near the swing. Now, she was finally getting revenge on him. The police had looked through their pictures and videos and were aghast. They were going to raid the warehouse. The criminals that had hurt Max and countless other dogs were finally going to be hurt too. Max had been the catalyst for everything, and now he sat in her lap, his ears still twitching at the slightest noise. He had made it this far, and so had she. Meeting Max was healing her as much as she was healing him. Scars from her past that had never died were finally dying off. "It's time," Officer Daniel said, walking in, and Sophie nodded. "What do you think will happen at the warehouse? Will they succeed?" The roads blurred past them as the convoy sped toward the location. Minutes later, they screeched to a halt in front of the warehouse. Police officers crept out of their cars with their weapons drawn. A gunshot rang out. Sophie ducked. Her heart pounded as she clutched Max's fur. Then, silence. The radio crackled. "We have them!" Relief flooded her, but the fight wasn't over. There were still dogs inside. The minutes stretched into what felt like hours. But then, the all-clear came. Sophie felt a rush of relief. They had done it. But the sight that met her when they entered the building left her breathless. Rows of cages, dogs of all breeds, Rottweilers, pit bulls, bulldogs, all looked like Max had, with their eyes wide with fear. Their bodies were covered in scars, some fresh, some scabbed over, but there was no mistaking the signs of brutality they had endured. But the soft whimpers and the desperate scratching of paws against the cages made her cry. "Max," she whispered to the dog hiding under her gown, "we did it." She turned to the rescue workers and their team. They had come with supplies and were already moving in on the dogs. The officers had taken down the criminals, but they still had to get the dogs help. Sophie helped free them and made sure every dog was given a collar and a blanket. She looked over at Max, who was standing away from her looking excited. It was as if he finally understood what was happening. The other dogs, like Max, needed to heal. They needed to be shown the love and care they had been deprived of for so long. They were going to rehabilitate them and give them a future. As the dogs were led out into the sunlight, Sophie felt very victorious. The media was thrown into a frenzy. Newspapers and blogs ran the news of the raid and rescue, and it was all everyone could talk about. Sophie was so happy that the dogs were saved. She took care of all of them with the rescue workers and brought them many treats. And she was not the only one. People from around the world donated money, treats, and toys to the rescued dogs, too. Max also helped. He licked the smaller ones and jumped on the bigger ones, trying to wake the excitement in them. He had healed so much. His wounds were gone and his fur was shiny and thick. His bark was even louder, and Sophie was so happy for him and proud of herself. She realized she needed to champion the cause for dogs all around the world, and she did. One afternoon the sun shone on her through a window as she stood behind a podium with a crowd's gaze on her. Max stood beside her, too. He seemed scared, but he was courageous and stood still. They had taught each other courage and resilience. The dog, who had once been terrified of shadows, now stood tall. Behind her, a banner with the words, "Animal Justice for All," fluttered in the breeze. The event was organized by local animal rescue groups. Sophie had become the face of the movement. She had started out wanting only to save one dog, but in the end she saved many more and brought awareness to the horror that lurked in the shadows of the city. I am standing here today with Max, she began, because his story is proof of what happens when we don't look away. It is also a reminder that there's still so much work to be done. We all know how easy it is to turn a blind eye when suffering is hidden behind closed doors, Sophie continued. Some of us have been bullied before, but the truth is, even when cruelty thrives in the dark, we, the community, should be the light that exposes it. Sophie looked down at Max, his scars now just faint lines. He looked back at her, his tail wagging. They had both healed. The crowd erupted into applause. Max barked once, loud and clear. They weren't finished yet. This story reminds us never to look away when people or animals are being hurt. It also reminds us that bullies and bad people are just people, and as a group, we can take them down.